Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're here to talk some shit, and in this case the Schiit Magnius to be precise. Now don't worry, I'm not about to drop shit jokes throughout this review because they probably would be shit jokes and not just shit jokes, if you know what I mean. So I'm not going to continue with the puns throughout, but I couldn't resist starting off with something like that. Anyway, we're here talking about the Schiit Magnius today, and the Magnus is a balanced amplifier for $200 that in some ways could be the best budget balanced amp on the market. But having recently reviewed the Geshelli Airish, I was curious to find out if it actually was. So let's start by talking about what the Magnus is and isn't. It's a fully balanced amplifier, meaning it's got fully balanced inputs, fully balanced output. It's also a preamplifier as well, and so it makes it a really versatile option for only $199 US. So that's really, really cheap for what you're getting here, based purely on the specs. Obviously, we'll get to the sound shortly. Now, for viewers in Australia, that means this amp's going to be about 280 Australian dollars, and I haven't factored in shipping costs or anything like that, but 199 US translates to roughly 280 Australian. The Magnus comes to us with super clean measurements in most cases, and I'll talk about that in a second, as well as buckets of power. So this thing will put 5 watts into 32 ohms, which is way more than you actually need for headphones. But in theory, that means it's got the grunt to have good control over your headphone drivers. For headphones all the way up to 600 ohms, you've still got 500 milliwatts on tap, and that's still plenty in almost all cases. So realistically, this should be a headphone amp that can drive just about anything in your collection. As always, before I start talking about how it sounds, let's talk a bit about the design and the layout of the amplifier itself. Starting on the front here, we've got the 4-pin XLR output for your balanced headphones. So yes, this is a fully balanced headphone amp, balanced in, balanced out. You've also got a 6.3mm headphone jack for the single-ended connection if you want to use that. You've got your volume knob, and you've got 2 buttons here. The first button being your gain button, the second button being for the input, so you can select between the RCA in and the XLR in. So everything you need is on the front except for the power, and that's a common theme in my reviews of shit gear is I do wish that the power switches were on the front and not the back, because I do like to switch this sort of gear off when it's not in use. Speaking of the back, if we turn it around, there is obviously the input for the power. Once again, like the Heresy that I recently reviewed, this uses a 15-volt AC power adapter. Now I didn't mention that it's AC in the Heresy review, but it's actually quite a key point, because the theory behind using an AC power adapter is that the AC power provides the positive and negative swings of voltage, which is exactly what the music needs to produce the positive and negative swings in the music. So the theory is there's less conversion of the power required, and therefore you're going to get, in theory, better quality sound, cleaner measurements, etc. After the power input, we've got the power switch that I just mentioned. I do wish this was on the front, but I understand that it might be necessary to have it on the back to keep the circuitry simple, keep the price down, etc. Moving on, we've got the outputs here, left and right outputs for single-ended. We've also got outputs for XLRs. So if you're running, say, studio monitors that use a balanced connection, this can drive those for you. I'll talk a bit more about the outputs in just a moment because there is something important you need to know, but it's great that it's got that option. Moving on, we've got the inputs from the RCAs. We've got inputs from XLR as well. So as I mentioned, fully balanced in, fully balanced out, or you can run single-ended in, and of course single-ended can feed the balanced output, the balanced input can feed the single-ended output. So everything feeds everything. There's no limitations with how you connect this up and how you choose to use it, other than the sound quality, and we'll get to that shortly. Now, if you're hearing some strange echoes in the recording, my voice is actually bouncing off the metal chassis here. I can hear it coming back to me, so apologies if there's any ringing or unusual echoes in the recording. It'll stop in a second when I put this down. Before I do put it down though, I just want to talk about a couple of things. One of them is these buttons on the front here, the edges of them are actually a little bit sharp. It's not sharp that it's going to cut you, but I noticed when I was doing something the other day that when I touched next to the button, it did feel a bit rough and a bit sharp, which is a bit of a drawback. But the feel of the actual action is really nice, it's really clean, so no complaints overall, but you can feel this isn't a premium amplifier, and nor should it be at $200. The other thing I want to talk about is that there's something missing for me from the front of this amp, and that's a mute switch for the outputs. What I mean by that is when you plug in headphones to this, it doesn't mute the preamp outputs. So if you are using active speakers that don't have their own power switch, you're going to have to find some other way to switch off those speakers if you want to use headphones while also having the speakers connected to the Magnus. I reached out to Schiit for an explanation for that, and what they confirmed was that it's because a 4-pin XLR socket doesn't have the muting switch functionality that a 6.3mm does. So there's actually no way for the headphone amp to know when you've plugged headphones into the 4-pin socket and therefore mute the outputs here. What Topping have done with the A90, which I should add is a much more expensive headphone amplifier, but what they've done and I really like is they've put a switch on the front that moves from power to headphone amp to preamp. And so it means you can very quickly select which outputs you're using, or the front ones or the back ones, based on your current situation. That would have been a really nice inclusion, but again, we need to point out this is a $200 headphone amp, so it's fair to expect that there are going to be some compromises made in order to keep that price down. For me though, the compromise probably should have been letting go of the single-ended circuit, and I'll explain why shortly, and instead putting a muting circuit in using some sort of switch. But let's talk a bit more about the sound, and you'll see why I'm saying to kick out the single-ended circuit and instead have some sort of a muting switch for hopefully the same cost in terms of parts and design input. So let's jump straight into talking about the sound now, because that's really what this is going to be all about. And a couple of the other things I'm going to talk about directly relate to the sound. So I'm going to bounce back and forth between a couple of the features and also the sound quality as it's relevant. So first and foremost, this is designed to be a balanced amp, and as a balanced amp it sounds incredibly clean, incredibly resolving, and really, really powerful and dynamic, especially given the price tag. Now, on its own, forgetting the price tag, it's a good amp. It's not a great amp, but it's still very, very good. And I'll share with you some comparisons shortly with the THX 789 from Drop and also with the Topping A90, just to put in perspective how it sits in the scheme of things. But I will say it's a very, very good amp when you're using it balanced. The problem is it's not a very good amp when you're using it single-ended. And Schiit have acknowledged this. I've seen comments on forums where Schiit representatives have come in and said that they understand that the single-ended circuit's not as good, and that decision was made to keep the costs down. Essentially, the single-ended, as I understand it, is only using one side of the balanced circuit. So with a balanced circuit, you've got a positive and a negative version of the same signal being processed, essentially. That's massively simplifying it, but the idea is that you get the positive and the negative elements, and it's able to therefore cancel out any issues such as distortion within the signal. Now, to keep the costs down on the Magnus, what they've done is they've just used one of those, whether it's the positive or the negative, they've used one of those channels only to feed the single-ended circuit. So you're not getting the benefit of that summing process to remove any distortion, and therefore the single-ended circuit is noisier and therefore doesn't sound anywhere near as good as the balanced. It sounds a bit thick, a bit muddy, and really not that enjoyable. It'll drive the headphones fine, there's still plenty of power, but the quality of the sound coming out is not as good as something like the Heresy, which is half the price. And in fact, that's exactly what Schiit is saying, is that if you only need a single-ended amplifier, don't buy the Magnus, buy the Heresy. And that's where, from my mind, they may have been better off to say the Heresy is our single-ended amplifier, the Magnus is our balanced amplifier, and not put the single-ended at all into the Magnus. Now that obviously does change the flexibility and the versatility, but when an amplifier has such a differential in terms of the quality between two inputs, I don't know many people are going to buy this for the ability to use single-ended, and certainly my recommendation would be don't buy this if you're looking to use single-ended, go straight to something like the Heresy. If, however, you're here to drive balanced headphones and you have a balanced source, then this is going to be a great option. But it is really important to know that you need to be feeding balanced in and you need to be taking balanced out. The single-ended input is equally as poor as the single-ended output. So don't think about running RCA in and getting great balanced output from your headphones. You need the balanced signal coming in and the balance signal coming out to actually get the full performance out of the Magnus. That also goes for the preamp outputs. So there's lots of things to think about here. If you're in any way using single-ended componentry and thinking about the Magnus, you probably need to have a good hard think about what your future setups are going to be and how quickly you're going to have a fully balanced setup if that's where you're heading. Because in the short term, single-ended from this is really underwhelming, particularly when you've got the Heresy or the Magni 3 Plus sitting there for half the price, doing great single-ended amplification and having a muted preamp out. For me, if there's any use of single-ended in your system, just go straight to the Magni 3 Plus or the Heresy. But if you are going to be running a fully balanced setup, this is definitely an amp worth thinking about. So don't get put off by what I've said about the single-ended circuits. They are a different ballgame altogether to what this thing can do balanced. When you do run a fully balanced signal into the Magnus, it's clean, it's detailed, it's quite refined for a budget amplifier, and it's very dynamic. It's got a really nice sense, similar to the Heresy that I just reviewed, a really nice sense of drive and dynamics in the sound. It's got a little bit of the same edge that the Heresy had, possibly a little bit less, I think, and that could be because of the balanced drive, I'm not sure, but what I do know is that the sound from this, to me, is just a little bit better than that from the Heresy. Ultimately, I'd say there is absolutely nothing to complain about with the balanced output sound quality from the Magnus. Similar to the Heresy, it throws a decent soundstage. It's not particularly wide, it's not particularly deep, but the instruments are all well separated and well delineated. So there's nothing to complain about. It does everything it's meant to do really, really well at the $200 price point. Because this is such a clean amplifier, in theory you can run everything from very sensitive IEMs all the way through to large driver insensitive headphones. But there is a caveat to that. Because the single-ended output is pretty poor, you're going to want to use the balanced output to get the best sound quality. The problem with that is the balanced output puts out more power. So what I found when I was using things like the Noble K10s or the AudioFly AF1120s was that yes, I could plug them in and there was a beautiful clean black background, but I didn't have much volume to play with, and there's some channel imbalance on the volume pot. Now, Schiit have chosen a very good volume pot here, but most volume pots will have this problem with channel imbalance, and it definitely reared its head for me because you're operating so low on the volume range. I was listening at about the 9 o'clock position on the volume knob, which doesn't give you much room to play, and if you've got anything lower than that going, there's a good chance you're going to start hearing channel imbalance. So realistically, I don't think this is a headphone amp you could choose if you want to use IEMs effectively. Technically, yes, it can do it, but effectively, I don't believe it can without resorting to the single-ended output, and then we're back to having this poor sound quality. So it's not a great option for me unless you're driving full-sized headphones. To put this into perspective, I thought the best thing I could do is provide some comparisons. The most obvious one being the THX 789. So the 789 here has for quite a while now been kind of the reference point for well-priced, well-made, well-measuring amplifiers. And whilst it costs a bit more than the Magnus, for me this is still a reference point if someone is looking for a well-priced budget amplifier that's going to perform really well. This is often the recommendation, and not just from me but from many people on the forums. In the back of my mind I'm also thinking about the Geshelli Airish, which I don't have here to do a direct comparison, but I can't help think that the Airish to me was right on par with the 789, but sounded a little bit more organic and natural, even though it had the limitation of only being pure balance, so balanced in, balanced out, nothing else. So all of a sudden we've got an interesting comparison point. The 789 gives us something more comparable to the Magnus, although the 789 doesn't have preamp outputs, it just has a pass-through, and the 789 is also not fully balanced. It does provide balanced output for your headphones, and it does take balanced input, but the signal doesn't stay fully balanced throughout. Whereas my understanding is the Magnus does. However, none of this matters if the sound quality is not as good. What I found when I compared the two was that the 789 does sound like the slightly better amplifier, purely on subjective sound quality. The tonality between the two is basically identical. They do both have a slightly electronic, digital sheen to the sound, whatever you want to call it, but it's slight. It's not going to get in the way of being a great listening experience, but you will find if you put it up next to something like the Geshelli Airish, you'll notice the difference between the very analog sound of the Airish and the very digital sound of these two. What that means is that for some headphones, particularly the more analytical headphones, these two might be a little bit too dry, whereas something like the Airish might be just right. On the flip side, if you've got something a bit warmer like an HD650, these could give a bit of extra dynamics and drive that maybe the Airish doesn't. So this is a case of horses for courses, where you want to choose the right amp to suit your needs. But back to the direct comparison here. For me, the 789 has a slightly more refined sound. It separates the instruments a little bit better. It has a slightly larger soundstage. That's about it though. So it's not a huge difference, but if you had the budget to spend, you're going to get a better amp with the 789. And again, I'm talking subjective sound quality only. I'm not talking about measurements, and I'm not talking about the fact that this one's fully balanced and this one's technically not. All I'm talking about is when I plug in headphones, which one do I subjectively prefer the sound of? And that's the 789 by a small amount. Now obviously other features may tip you in one direction or the other. The pass-through ability of the 789 to daisy chain to another amplifier is really handy. Also, it will comfortably drive IEMs because it doesn't have the same channel imbalance problems, and the single-ended circuit is also excellent. The Magnus, on the other hand, can work as a very good preamp because it is so clean and it is so detailed. You're going to get excellent sound from a set of studio monitors so long as they're connected from the XLR outputs. So on this one, I'd say if it's pure sound quality you're looking for, the 789 is probably still a better choice. If you don't have the budget though, you're going to come so close to this kind of sound quality by buying the Magnus that it's a really great deal. Also, if you need the preamp functionality, then the Magnus should absolutely be your choice because the 789 just can't do it. The other amplifier compared with the Magnus, just out of interest, was the Topping A90 that I've currently got here for review, and that's coming soon. So, by the way, make sure you subscribe if you do want to see my review of the Topping D90 and A90 stack. But in terms of comparison, I was just interested to see how much difference there is if you're spending 3 or 4 times as much on the amplifier. Are you getting that much better sound quality? And what I found is that once again, in terms of tonality, the Magnus and the A90 are really pretty similar. But just like with the 789, the A90 pulls ahead in its overall refinement. The sound's all a bit smoother. It's got a little bit less of that digital glare, if you want to call it that. The soundstage is larger and a little bit deeper, and definitely what it does well is it's a bit more holographic in the sound as well. So essentially what I'm seeing is with this style of amplifier, these integrated circuit amplifiers that are all designed to get maximum measurement quality, what I'm noticing is that at the very base level, you're getting a slightly digitized sound, but it's very clean, it's very detailed and very resolving. As you go further up the ranks, what you start to hear is that that sound becomes a bit more refined, you get a bit more space in the soundstage, but your tonality is not really changing. The other benefit you do get as you spend more money is you get a bit more versatility with better single-ended circuitry, some better features and functions such as the preamp, headphone amp, output switch on the Topping A90 that I mentioned. So there's things that you get as you spend more money, and it all comes down to working out what's valuable to you. Now, if it sounds like I'm knocking the Magnus in this review, I'm definitely not. But having watched and read a few other reviews of this amplifier, I thought it was really important to paint the full picture here. And the full picture is that this is outstanding value if you're looking for a very clean, very resolving, fully balanced amplifier. It's very hard to go past this. However, if you want a warmer sound, the Geshelli Airish is very similar to the Magnus and is going to give you that more analog sound. Funnily enough, the Airish is that pure balanced design that I spoke about at the beginning, but the Airish doesn't have any preamp outputs. So ultimately today, I think if somebody was to ask me what amplifier would I buy if I had $200 to spend for a fully balanced amplifier, it would all come down to 2 questions. Question 1 is, do I need a preamp? If I want the preamp functionality, the Magnus is an absolute no-brainer. If, however, the preamp is not important, it would then come down to what's my taste in music and or what headphones am I currently using. If you want your amp to sound clean and lean and resolving, then the Magnus is the go. If you wanted something with a touch more analog feel, then you'd probably go back over to the Airish, knowing that you're giving up the functionalities of the preamp. So once again, this is a great amp. I don't want this to come across in any way as a negative review. It was more a review that I thought was important to put everything in context. This is a fantastic amp. It's got its limitations, but at the price point, you always should expect that. Anybody who's expecting a $200 amp to perform and have the features and functions of $800, $900, $1,000 amplifiers hasn't done their homework on what goes into making these. So don't expect this to be a world beater or a giant killer, but absolutely if you're looking to get into balanced audio, balanced in, balanced out, you should definitely take a good look at the Schiit Magnius. For any of you waiting on my review of the M scaler, it is coming, but I want to make sure I put enough research into it to really explain what the M scaler is doing. So do bear with me, it might be an extra week beyond what I originally said, but it is on the way. Also, talking about things that are coming up, I've already mentioned the D90 and the A90 review, but I wanted to also tell you that I've got an interview coming up with Jason Stoddard from Schiit. So I'll be asking him a whole lot of questions, some of which came from my interviews with Rob Watts about how DACs work, but some of it based on the amplifier technology used by Schiit and some of the marketing decisions they've made, such as moving from their traditional use of only discrete circuits to talk about why they've started using integrated circuits in examples like the Heresy and now also in the Magnus. So do stay tuned, make sure you subscribe if you want to see those, and I've got plenty of other great content in the pipeline. I hope you found this review helpful. If you have, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button. Thanks for watching, happy listening, and I'll see you again next time here on Passion for Sound.